Admiral Thrax Vorn of the Xylosian Imperial Navy stood on the observation deck of the Sword of Vengeance, watching 10,000 warships stretch across the black in perfect formation. Each vessel carried enough firepower to crack a planet. Each crew had trained for this moment across 3 generations. The humans had refused every ultimatum. Final jump calculated, his navigation officer reported. 20 seconds to Earth orbit. Thrax's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. The humans possessed primitive fusion drives and kinetic weapons. Intelligence suggested they had spent the past decade arguing among themselves about whether to fight or negotiate. They had chosen neither. They had simply waited. Jump, Thrax commanded. 10,000 ships tore through the fabric of space and emerged in the Sol system. Earth hung before them, a blue-white marble speckled with clouds. The fleet sensors swept across the void, searching for resistance. They found nothing. No defense platforms, no warship formations, no orbital fortresses. "Where are they?" his first officer whispered. Thrax studied the tactical display. Earth's moon orbited silently. The asteroid belt churned with rock and ice. "Scan for cloaked vessels," he ordered. "No energy signatures, Admiral." "The system is empty." The silence stretched into something wrong. Thrax had conquered 14 species. He had never encountered a civilization that did not cluster their defenses around their homeworld. Then a transmission crackled across every frequency. "It's not a warning. It's not a declaration of war. Just a voice, calm, tired, and utterly without fear. You should have stayed home." Thrax's blood chilled. "All ships, emergency dispersion pattern Delta now." Too late. The first wave of missiles came from behind them. They emerged from the asteroid belt, hundreds of projectiles moving at fractions of light speed. Each missile carried no warhead. No explosives. Just mass. Just velocity. The Sword of Vengeance shuddered as 3 impacts tore through its rear escort. Thrax watched 12 ships vanish from his display in less than a heartbeat. Then 20. Then 50. "Where are they firing from?" he roared. Sensors painted the asteroid belt with frantic energy. Among the rocks hidden behind thermal shielding, the humans had built something impossible. Just tubes and magnets, and rocks turned into bullets. 2,000 ships died in the first minute. "Return fire," Thrax screamed. "Locate their platforms." The fleet's weapons cycled, vaporizing rock and metal. But each platform was cheap. Each platform was disposable. For everyone they destroyed, 2 more launched their payloads before dying. 3,000 ships gone. His formation had shattered into clusters of survivors, each group fighting independently, each group dying alone. "We push through," Thrax decided. All ships toward Earth. The platforms cannot fire through their own planet's gravity well. 4,000 ships burned hard for the blue-white world below. Then the drones came. They rose from Earth's atmosphere like insects fleeing a burning nest, millions of small craft, each carrying a single nuclear warhead. No pilots. No fear. Just machines programmed to die. The fleet's point defense weapons carved through the first wave. But the drones kept coming. They learned. Each wave adjusted its approach faster than any AI Thrax had encountered in 50 years of warfare. "They're adapting," his tactical officer whispered. The patterns are changing faster than we can counter. Thrax watched a human ship, a single battered cruiser with armor patched and welded, charge directly into his formation. It fired no weapons. It simply accelerated until its reactor went critical and turned a dozen Xylosian vessels into scrap. The humans were fighting like they had nothing to lose. Because they didn't. Deploy the ground army, Thrax ordered. All 400,000. We take their cities. We end this from the inside. He watched the landing craft descend through fire and smoke, and told himself that no species could fight on two fronts. He was wrong. Commander Velox of the Assault Legion hit the ground running. His drop pod slammed into a paved roadway outside a human settlement called Seattle. The streets were empty. Form up, he ordered. A sweep and clear. A window shattered. 3 of his soldiers fell. The shots came from everywhere. Sewers, rooftops, alleyways. Where are they? He demanded. His tactical display showed hundreds of individual contacts appearing and vanishing, each one a ghost, each one a killer. The humans weren't fighting a war. They were fighting a hunt. After 6 hours, Velox had lost half his legion. After 12, he stopped counting. The Sword of Vengeance drifted in high orbit, its weapons firing continuously at drone swarms that never seemed to thin. Thrax had not slept in 2 days. His fleet had been reduced to 800 ships. They're evacuating cities, his first officer reported. We're not breaking their will, admirals. We're just killing people who keep fighting back. Find me a weakness, Thrax snapped. There has to be. The ship shuddered. Not an impact from outside. Something internal. Boarding party, the security chief shouted. They came through a maintenance airlock. How? Thrax demanded. The human ships were all engaged. The drone swarms were still attacking. They didn't use ships, his tactical officer breathed. They launched themselves from the surface in suits. Human beings had jumped into vacuum and attached themselves to the hull of the Sword of Vengeance. Not soldiers. Not commandos. Miners in pressure suits carrying demolition charges. Dock workers with cutting torches. Stop them, Thrax ordered. Kill them all. The humans died in the corridors. Shot, burned, but they kept coming. Each death bought time for the next. Thrax grabbed a weapon and ran to intercept them himself. He found the last survivor standing outside the reactor room door. A woman, gray hair, welding burns scarred her hands. You wanted our world, she said. Now choke on it. She pressed the button. The explosion didn't destroy the Sword of Vengeance. It did something worse. The reactor destabilized, flooding the ship with radiation, turning the flagship into a floating tomb. Thrax escaped through an emergency launch tube, his skin blistering as behind him 10,000 crew members died in darkness. A damaged cruiser recovered him. He sat on the floor watching his fleet burn and waited for the end. As it didn't come, the humans stopped firing. The drone swarms withdrew. Thrax's remaining ships, fewer than 100, drifted in the black. A transmission came through. Not from Earth, from the Xylosian homeworld. You have failed, the Emperor said. His voice carried no emotion, which made it worse. Thrax looked at his tactical display. 87 vessels remained combat capable. He had led the greatest fleet in Xylosian history to humanity's doorstep. He was leaving with 9 ships that could still travel. Set course for home, he told his helmsman. The journey took 3 weeks. Thrax spent them staring at the wound where Earth had been, replaying every decision. The humans had not won because they were stronger. They had won because they were willing to become something that empires could not defeat. They had become a fever. The throne room of the Xylosian Emperor had witnessed 1,000 victories. Today it held only silence and shame. Admiral Thrax Vorn stood before the golden dais, his uniform burned, his medals stripped. 9 ships, the Emperor said. From 10,000. Explain. Thrax raised his head. We attacked humanity on their own ground, he said. We expected them to fight like a civilization, to value their ships, to surrender when defeat became inevitable. He paused. They value nothing except the act of resistance, he said. They will burn their own worlds to deny them to an enemy. They do not fight for survival. They fight because fighting is what they are. The Emperor's claws tightened on his throne. You speak as if they are not rational. No, Emperor, Thrax said. I speak as if they are something we have never encountered. A species that evolved on a world that tried to kill them every day. They survived not because they were the strongest, but because they refused to die. Thrax stepped forward, ignoring the guards who raised their weapons. They sent 10,000 ships to take humanity's homeworld. Fewer than 10 survived. Not because we were weak. Because they are something we do not know how to fight. The Emperor stared at him for a long moment. Then he ordered all records of the battle sealed. He ordered Thrax executed for treason. He ordered the fleet rebuilt and the humans forgotten. But the transmission logs leaked. The surviving crews talked. Across the galaxy, other species who had suffered under Xylosian rule began to whisper. One word spoken with fear. Spoken with hope. All humans. The whispering reached a research outpost on the edge of Veth space 4 months later, carried through smuggled data fragments and the careful retelling of crew members who had defected rather than face execution alongside their admiral. Scholar Dren Olick had spent 30 years cataloging the military doctrines of every spacefaring species the Veth Collective had encountered. He had a system, every species fit somewhere in it. Aggressive expanders, defensive isolationists, mercantile opportunists, the system had never failed him. He listened to the recovered transmission logs from the Sword of Vengeance 3 times before he called an emergency session of the Collective Strategic Council. This is not a new category, he told them. This is the absence of every category we have built. The council did end. A lot believe him at first. 10,000 ships, 9 survivors. The numbers alone seemed designed to provoke disbelief rather than analysis, the kind of figure that propaganda produced rather than honest combat reports. Dren played them the recording of the woman's voice. Gray hair, welding burns, you wanted our world, now choke on it. The council chamber was silent for a long time after that. Councillor Vash, the eldest member present, finally spoke. What does a species do, she asked, when conventional deterrence assumes an adversary who values their own survival above all things and the adversary does not? Dren had no answer ready. He had spent 3 decades building answers. This question had arrived faster than any answer could follow it. He spent the next 2 years trying to build one anyway. The framework he eventually proposed to the Veth Collective was titled, in the dry administrative language the Council preferred, Revised Threat Assessment Protocols for Encounters with High-Resistance Adaptive Species. Everyone who read it called it something else. They called it the human problems. It was not a problem with a solution. Dren was careful to state this explicitly in his opening section, because every previous threat assessment the collective had produced ended with a recommended course of action, and this one could not. He wrote that humanity did not respond to the standard calculus of overwhelming force, because overwhelming force assumed a threshold past which resistance became irrational, and humanity's military history, going back further than their spacefaring era, showed no evidence that such a threshold existed for them. He wrote that the only documented instance of a major power successfully engaging human military forces without catastrophic losses was not through superior firepower, but through an alliance proposal delivered before hostilities began, by a smaller species who had studied the Xylosian disaster carefully, and concluded that the only viable strategy was to never become the enemy in the first place. He cited a recent first contact between humanity and a research division of the Keth Collective, in which 70 years of careful observation had revealed something the Xylosian War had proven through 11,000 combined deaths. That humans considered the line between civilian and combatant to be a tactical inconvenience rather than a moral absolute, the moment they believed their survival required crossing it. That every individual human appeared to carry an internal calculation, invisible from the outside, determining exactly how much they were willing to sacrifice for a cause they had judged worthy. And that calculation was frequently, catastrophically, higher than any other species the collective had documented. He included, in an appendix that several council members found difficult to finish reading, detailed accounts gathered from Xylosian survivors of the ground campaign. A teacher who had held a kindergarten classroom against an assault squad for 40 minutes using nothing but furniture and a single hunting rifle, buying time for her students to escape through a tunnel that did not appear on any building schematic the invading force had access to. A grandmother who had walked into a Xylosian forward command post carrying what her interrogators believed was medical supplies, and was not. A 12-year-old boy who had, according to 3 separate confirmed accounts, thrown himself in front of a wounded soldier to absorb a killing shot meant for someone he had known for less than a day. Dren wrote in his closing analysis that the Veth Collective's existing strategic doctrine had no framework for a species in which this behavior was not an anomaly produced by extraordinary individuals under extraordinary circumstances, but appeared to be a baseline capacity present across the species as a whole, activated reliably whenever the stakes were judged sufficiently high. He recommended, above all other considerations, that the collective never test the threshold directly. He recommended diplomatic engagement, conducted with the specific understanding that humanity could not be coerced through threat, could not be reliably predicted through standard game theory models built on rational self-preservation, and could not be defeated through any application of force the collective currently possessed or was likely to possess within the next century. He recommended, in language that several counselors found unusually direct for a formal strategic document, that the collective consider what humanity might want, rather than what could be taken from them, because taking had already been tried by a species with considerably more military capacity than the Veth currently fielded, and the attempt had produced 9 surviving ships out of 10,000. The council debated the framework for 6 months. In the end, they adopted it nearly unchanged. The first formal Veth diplomatic mission to humanity departed 18 months later, carrying no weapons, no demands, and a delegation specifically selected for their expertise in collaborative resource development rather than military negotiation. Scholar Dren Olick was not part of that delegation. He had requested to remain behind, citing his age and his preference for analysis over fieldwork, though several colleagues privately believed the truth was simpler. That he had spent 2 years reading about what humanity was willing to do when cornered, and had developed, somewhere in the writing of his report, a respect bordering on something he did not have a word for in his own language, and was not yet certain he wanted to test in person. The Veth delegation returned 11 months later with a trade agreement, a cultural exchange program, and a piece of information that Dren found more valuable than either. Humanity, it turned out, remembered the Xylosian War not as a triumph to be celebrated, but as a tragedy they had been forced into, one they spoke of with the particular grief reserved for violence that should never have been necessary. They had not wanted the wars. They had simply refused to lose it once it arrived at their door. Dren included this detail in the final revision of his framework, in a section he added specifically for it. He titled the section What They Actually Want, and it was, by a significant margin, the shortest section in the entire document. It read to be left alone until they are needed, and then, apparently, to be everything a species could possibly need them to be. He filed the report. He never updated it again. It did not need updatings. It had already told the collective everything that mattered. If this story gave you that feeling, the specific cold satisfaction of watching an empire learn exactly what it had unleashed by underestimating us, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Every week we bring you the best HFY science fiction, stories about humanity that remind you why no civilization in the galaxy wants to be the one that tests us first. Subscribe right now. Hit the bell. Share this story today with someone who needs to remember what we are capable of when we are pushed too far. We are still here. 9 ships out of 10,000. We are always still here. 3 years after the Veth delegation returned with their trade agreement, a second power decided to test what scholar Dren Olick had recommended they never test. The Korathi Dominion had not read his report. They had heard about it secondhand, filtered through trade gossip and diplomatic rumor, and had concluded that a species capable of writing such a cautious document about humanity must be exaggerating, the way smaller powers often exaggerated threats to justify their own caution. The Korathi had conquered 11 star systems through a doctrine built entirely around decapitation strikes. Identify the political and military leadership of a target civilization. Eliminate them in a single overwhelming assault before any organized resistance could form. Install a compliant government. Move on to the next system. It had worked every time. Admiral Ussa Kor studied the Xylosian disaster for 6 months before presenting her counter-strategy to the Dominion's War Council. The Xylosians failed, she told them, because they tried to conquer humanity the way they conquered everyone else. Slow buildup, visible fleet, time for the humans to prepare a defense in depth. She proposed something different. A single strike force, small enough to evade detection, fast enough to reach Earth before any defensive network could mobilize, targeted not at the planet's military infrastructure, but at 12 specific coordinates where the Dominion's intelligence placed the entirety of humanity's senior political and military leadership. Kill the leadership in the first 90 seconds, she argued, and the chaotic, individualistic resistance the Xylosians faced becomes impossible to organize. No command structure, no coordination, Just isolated humans fighting isolated battles that a disciplined occupation force can mop up over months rather than days. The War Council approved the strike. Admiral Corps' force consisted of 400 fast attack vessels, stripped of everything except weapons and speed, designed for exactly one mission and never intended to fight a sustained engagement. They emerged from hyperspace 11,000 kilometers above Geneva, the location the Dominion's intelligence had identified as housing the highest concentration of human leadership, and immediately began their strike run. The first thing Admiral Corps noticed was that the coordinates were wrong. Not wrong in the sense of inaccurate, wrong in the sense that the buildings her intelligence had identified as government centers had been empty for 14 months, repurposed as public memorial sites following what human records describe as a deliberate, system-wide relocation of political and military command structures into distributed, redundant, and deliberately undisclosed locations. The relocation had happened immediately after the Xylosian War ended. Humanity had looked at what nearly happened to them, the near catastrophe of a war that could have ended very differently if certain command nodes had been destroyed in the opening hours, and had spent 14 months systematically eliminating the possibility that any single strike could ever decapitate them again. There was no leadership to kill. There were instead 47,000 individually authorized regional defense commanders, each with full operational autonomy, each trained to act without waiting for centralized orders, each connected to a redundant communication network that had no single point of failure because it had been deliberately designed by engineers who remembered exactly how close the Sword of Vengeance had come to ending the war very differently in its opening hour. Admiral Corps' force discovered this within the first 4 minutes, when weapons fire began arriving from 41 separate, independently coordinated defense platforms that her intelligence had not known existed, because they had not existed when her intelligence was gathered, because humanity had built an entirely new defensive doctrine in the time between the Xylosian War and the Korathi arrival. 312 of her 400 ships were destroyed in the first 11 minutes. The remaining 88 retreated in a configuration that Admiral Corps would later describe, in the brief report she filed before resigning her commission, as the most disciplined and devastating defensive response she had encountered in 30 years of military service. They did not pursue. This detail troubled her more than the losses had. A communication arrived as her surviving ships crossed back through the system's outer boundary. The same calm, tired voice that the Xylosian transmission logs had documented years earlier, though Admiral Corps would never know if it was the same person. "You came for our leaders," the voice said. "We do not have leaders the way you mean it. We have neighbors who decided, a long time ago, that no single point of failure would ever again decide whether we survived." The transmission ended. Admiral Corps filed her report, resigned her commission, and spent the remainder of her career advising the Korathi Dominion's diplomatic corps instead of its military. Having concluded that the lesson scholar Dren Olich had tried to teach the galaxy was not a strategic curiosity to be studied from a safe distance, but a warning that grew more urgent every time someone ignored it. The Korathi Dominion opened diplomatic relations with humanity 8 months later. They did not ask for trade concessions. They asked, in the careful and deferential language that Admiral Corps herself had drafted for the occasion, whether humanity might be willing to share their distributed command doctrine, because the Dominion had several worlds of their own that had grown understandably nervous about exactly the kind of decapitation strike their own military had built its entire reputation on. Humanity agreed. They asked for nothing in return except an apology to the families of the 11 crew members lost in the brief engagement, an apology the Dominion delivered formally, publicly, and without the diplomatic hedging such admissions usually required. Scholar Dren Olick, by then very old, read the full account of the Korathi engagement with something that felt, for the first time in his long career of cataloging threats, like genuine relief rather than professional satisfaction. He added a final note to his original framework before filing it permanently into the Veth Collective's historical archive. He wrote, "We were right to be cautious. We were wrong to assume caution alone would be sufficient. The lesson here is not only that humanity cannot be easily defeated, it is that they learn faster than any species we have encountered, and every attempt against them makes the next attempt harder because they do not forget and they do not stop building." He closed the file. He never opened it again. It had told the galaxy everything it needed to know twice now, and he trusted that the third time, if it ever came, someone else would be the one writing the warning, because he had finally, after a long career of studying war, allowed himself to hope that no one would be foolish enough to need it. If this story gave you that feeling, the specific cold satisfaction of watching Empire after Empire learn the same impossible lesson, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Every week we bring you the best HFY science fiction. Stories about humanity that remind you why no civilization in the galaxy wants to be the one that tests us first. Subscribe right now. Hit the bell. I'll share this story today with someone who needs to remember what we are capable of when we are pushed too far. We are still here. We learn faster than anyone expects. We are always still here. The story of the Korathi strike force spread faster than the Xylosian disaster ever had. Partly because the galaxy was already listening, primed by years of rumor and half-confirmed reports about the species that had reduced 10,000 warships to 9. Partly because Admiral Kor herself, once she resigned her commission, became something the galaxy had never quite had before. A military officer willing to speak openly in interviews broadcast across a dozen species information networks about exactly how badly her own assumptions had failed her. She did not frame it as humanity being unbeatable. She was careful about that distinction in every interview, every recorded statement, every testimony she gave before increasingly curious diplomatic councils across known space. What she said, consistently, was that humanity had done something no other species had managed. They had taken catastrophic near failure and converted it, completely and permanently, into structural resilience. The Xylosians lost 9,991 ships and called it victory because they survived. The lesson they extracted was narrow: defend the asteroid belt, watch for primitive weapon platforms, account for suicide tactics. Humanity had extracted something deeper. They had looked at how close their command structure came to collapsing in those opening minutes, when a single well-placed strike on the wrong building at the wrong time could have decapitated their entire response. And they had rebuilt themselves so that no single building, no single leader, no single point of failure could ever again hold that kind of power over their survival. This is the part Admiral Kor returned to again and again in her later years, speaking to military academies across 3 different species territories, trying to explain something that her own culture's strategic doctrine had no natural language for. Most species, she said, treat a near disaster as something to recover from. Humanity treats it as raw material. A Threnar War College invited her to lecture 2 years into her advisory career. The cadets, young and still building their understanding of galactic threat assessment, asked her the question every audience eventually asked. Could the Dominion have won if Admiral Kor's strike had succeeded? If the coordinates had been correct, if humanity's leadership had still been concentrated in those 12 locations. She thought about this question for a long time before answering, because she had asked it of herself many times in the years since her resignation. No, she finally said, we would have killed people. Important people, perhaps, people who mattered to the humans who knew them. But we would not have ended their capacity to resist because that capacity was never centralized in those 12 buildings to begin with. It was distributed across 47,000 commanders who had already trained, already prepared, already built an entire doctrine, specifically anticipating that someone like me would eventually try exactly what I tried. We were 8 months too late to succeed, she said, and 47,000 years too early to ever succeed again. The cadets had laughed at that, the nervous laughter of young officers encountering a truth too large to fully process yet. Admiral Kaur had not laughed. She had spent the rest of that lecture describing, in careful detail, the transmission she received as her surviving ships retreated. The calm voice. We do not have leaders the way you mean it. We have neighbors who decided a long time ago that no single point of failure would ever again decide whether we survived. She told the cadets that this sentence had occupied more of her thinking in the years since than any tactical analysis she had ever conducted. Because it suggested something the Dominion's entire military philosophy was built to ignore. That power, concentrated for efficiency, was always vulnerable to exactly the kind of strike her doctrine specialized in. And that humanity, having learned this once at catastrophic cost, had simply refused to remain vulnerable to it ever again, no matter what efficiency they sacrificed to achieve that refusal. Scholar Dren Olick, reading transcripts of Admiral Kaur's lectures in his final years, found himself returning to a question he had never fully resolved in his original framework. It's not whether humanity could be defeated. He had long since concluded they probably could be, given sufficient force applied with sufficient patience and sufficient willingness to absorb losses that no rational species would normally accept. The question that lingered was different. Whether any species in the galaxy, having witnessed what happened to the Xylosians and then the K. Orathi would ever again possess the particular combination of arrogance and ignorance required to actually try. He suspected in his final years that the answer was eventually going to be yes. Someone somewhere would always believe their intelligence was better, their tactics were sharper, their understanding of the human problem more sophisticated than everyone who had failed before them. It was, he had come to believe, simply the nature of power. Every generation produced new leaders who believed the old lessons did not apply to them. But he also believed, and wrote this in the very last addition he ever made to his original framework before his death, that each failed attempt made the next one less likely to succeed, and more likely to end exactly the way the previous ones had ended. Because humanity, it turned out, was very good at exactly one specific thing above all others. They never stopped building on what they had already survived. If this story gave you that feeling, the quiet certainty that some lessons only need to be taught once before the rest of the galaxy starts paying attention, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Every week we bring you the best HFY science fiction, stories about humanity that remind you why every empire that comes for us eventually walks away changed, or does not walk away at all. Subscribe right now. Hit the bell. Share this story today with someone who needs to remember what we build out of what nearly breaks us. We are still here. We turn near disaster into permanent strength. We are always still here.